All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you see it?
I can.
Okay, great. So thanks, Karina, for meeting. We can chat a bit today about the release orchestration category vision, and then kind of all of the elements that we have here, similar to the deep dive that we did recently on, was that feature flags that we did the last one on? Or
Secrets Management.
I don't remember. Okay, but yeah, we'll just go through the section here. I'll talk a little bit less about what the sections are like I did last time when I was introducing what this page was. But I will talk about what the things are that are important here, and probably also notice a few areas where it could be updated. And we'll touch on that. So what the release orchestration category is, well, I guess first I'll take a step back and talk about the overall product vision for release here. Release orchestration is one of the categories that makes it up. And it's at the minimal level of maturity now. It's a relatively new one that we've just started launching features on. Environments is probably the biggest feature that's out there, that's been there for a while. So those are in GitLab now. It's where you can create like your production environment or your staging environment to deploy to those and manage those. And it's also the ad hoc environments that are created by the review apps, for example. So everything that's on that environment page in GitLab. And then there's also variables that go with environments that are sort of related to that as well. Then there's some other things that are coming up, like blackout periods, the relationships between releases, parallelization of releases, sequencing of different projects, and things like that. But really what this is all about in total is you can think about it as the things that a release manager might have done at a company that you've worked at, where either a release manager still does it and they need tooling to enable them to successfully do that, or it's more automated now and teams are sort of taking ownership for it and we're providing that automation. But it's sort of tied into what, at least in a legacy sense, a release manager might have manually done, especially even in Excel or something like that, where people, me as a release manager in most of my career, was shopping around an Excel doc with all of my milestones and environment scheduling and everything like that. So that's what this category is all about. And environment scheduling is actually one that I don't think is in here yet, but we talked about recently. We heard on a customer call about how scheduling environments is a potentially interesting thing that some teams are looking for. But I won't jump ahead to that too much now, but it's just it reminded me of that. The one thing that I will jump forward to is this manual process versus automation idea. Did you hear a question?
Nope, I'm.
Okay. Looked like you were about to ask something, but so. Like I said, this is all based on that traditional release manager role, which I and many others have done manually and in different ways, historically. But here at GitLab, we're trying to provide a better path forward. So we want to start by building out automation first. And an interesting example is actually the environment scheduling one. So there's one thing that people might ask for, and that is sort of an obvious solution, is just like kind of a calendar where you can manually type in reservations, and it's essentially like an environment reservation Excel document. And that feature might help some people, but we don't really want to start there. We don't want to build that feature first. What we want to try and do first is think about how can we make this work for teams that don't want to have this manual process, and like, could it be tied into the pipelines, for example, or could it be tied into the releases feature, so that when a release is created, if certain projects are part of it, then environments get reserved based on some rules or something like that. And then it's all just sort of coordinated and managed. That said, sometimes that new thing is really hard and you need to provide a short-term solution, in which case then we will consider that sort of thing. And then also sometimes it's going to be a long time until we get to that thing, or we just don't see like a broad-based demand for it. What we don't want to do is block out people who have no other option by saying, well, we have this vision for automation in the future. What we really want to make sure, though, is that we're just considering that and weighing those options and making the best decision, and not just jumping into, I guess, what was requested that people in this role might be thinking about. It's something that we do across all of GitLab to try and think in that way. But with this release orchestration category in particular, it's really easy to just kind of hear customers talking about more legacy solutions. And for me, at least personally, having done my career in release management, it's easy to, in my own head, sort of jump to those solutions that I'm familiar with and comfortable with. So that's something that for the release orchestration category in particular, we try to be super aware of. Apart from that, though, just to give a brief tour here, there's the issue list, overall vision, which we looked at already in the UX research. So the release orchestration label here has all of the issues. You can see it's one that we're investing in quite a lot because we've got a lot of items scheduled out in the next few releases. You can also look at popularity here and see what some of the most interesting ones are from a customer upvotes perspective. And you can see, actually, this is an interesting one. This has got a lot of upvotes since the last time I looked at it. What this feature is being able to generate a release, not from an API call in the GitLab CI YAML, but just like in a native way, like directly in the YAML. This is actually on the maturity viable plan already for the category. But it's great that we're getting a lot of upvotes here. It's one nice thing about this category is there's a ton of interest. And you can see from the popularity of these issues, even though this was only open 5 months ago, it's already collected this many upvotes. It just shows the excitement that people have for this feature. So that's one cool thing there. We did go back to release, and then we also have this UX research issue for release and verify. But if you're planning on doing any UX research related to any of these features, you can engage with the UX research team through that issue. And then historically, you can also find interesting things there. There's also the public, yeah.
No, I was just saying, I think that that's great, and I actually did see that. And as we're starting to dip into release orchestration and release management, one of the things, there's a lot of possibilities there, and how we approach it. And so that's definitely something I think we'll leverage as we start to just get into upcoming releases and release types and things like that, is do the research and get and utilize that user experience piece. So that's awesome.
Yep. Then we also have the category epic, which is kind of like the discussion area for that issue. We haven't had anybody jump in here yet. Typically, people will just jump in directly to the specific issue, but we have this just in case anybody wants to comment on this page in general.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this already. Compliance and security are also super related to this. We have the release governance category, which contains secrets management, both of which you actually also own. So when it comes to like evidence collection, ensuring that even that audit dashboard, that's sort of been an interesting topic lately.
The change board.
Exactly, yeah. That's kind of tied into here as well. And we're specifically not making that part of the scheduling and orchestration of releases so that we can think about that separately. But that's linked to here because people will typically be interested in both.
Yeah, and I think that's good to separate them, because I think that release governance can go pretty deep. So. Yep.
So then, what's next and why? We're starting to get into now what this category is all about. The environments dashboard is something that's really important for certain kinds of users. Mm-hmm. So we recently added a pipeline dashboard, which tells you which pipelines are running and where and what their status is, which is more interesting if you're a development team. But if you're an operations team supporting a release or supporting a number of releases, what you care about is, okay, what's currently deployed to staging? And what are the versions of everything that's there? Is it down right now because it's being deployed to? Is it, or is it down because something has been deployed there and it doesn't work? QA folks have these kinds of questions. Release managers have these kinds of questions. And product managers who are wondering, where has my feature been deployed to yet, have these kinds of questions. So adding an environment-oriented dashboard will help them just kind of see the big picture in terms of what's out there in the environment landscape and know what's going on. There isn't really any clear way to do this in the product right now. You can you can sort of do it on a project by project basis, but this will really, really help.
Yep, absolutely. And then one of the things I think about too here, and maybe this is an opportunity for an update, your thoughts on understanding what's the state of the environments, what changes, you know, like you said, from the product manager persona to the release manager to the developer. There's an opportunity there to also, like, thinking way beyond, to communicate and share information in our ecosystem about that. And so when I think about that, I think about like our ecosystem product area that just recently was established. And is this something that maybe we would partner across stage with them on that sort of ecosystem capability of being able to tie this information around the different stages and share that information through messaging and personas?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah, the ecosystem is such a broad broad area that's all about the different integrations and things. So you can think of a billion different things. But yeah, for sure. In general, also, we want all of our features to sort of tie into the single application, and like you can get to the environment from maybe the merge request, and those kinds of things are good to think about. And so, yeah, no, that could tie that all together.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, and actually I was thinking it earlier too, but I'll bring it in, is we think about the release manager persona here. Mm-hmm. And one of our focuses is, you know, developer persona is definitely high on our focus when we build when we're building our application. So there's you know, there's always this healthy tension between groups of how you balance change. So I think it's interesting how we look at personas around this. One, we get a lot of feedback from the community on the developer perspective of how we do some of these things that might not align with the release manager persona. And I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's true. And so some of that tension comes into play with what I was talking about here, where release managers may want, and this is sort of going into release governance, but it's a really good example, like a change control process, and what approvals are required in order for a release to move from the staging to the production environment, for example, for a more traditional process. And developers just want to be able to deploy production. They want everything to be automated, where the release management team or the change management team may be more oriented around making sure that the controls are in place and that things are documented, that the appropriate approvals are there. And so there is a tension there. And it's up to us to try and be very creative about how we implement that. It's a good example because the way that request was given to us very frequently is, I need a way to have a manual job in pipelines that only like a certain person can approve. And so you could do that, but the problem is that now you're starting to load up your pipelines with these manual steps, and you're breaking automation in a way that, yes, maybe it services the needs that you have as an organization now, but it's sort of trapping you in a local optimization where, you know, once you have that process in place, it's hard to ever get rid of it. And it's hard to ever then automate fully because you've always got this, you know, manual step in there. So what we ended up doing is we're implementing that feature as approvals in the merge request, but only enforced later during the pipeline. So it sort of creates a hybrid solution that release managers and change managers can be happy with, because it's enforcing the approvals that need to be there, but it's also not putting a pause in the pipeline, where because those approvals can be collected earlier in the normal development kind of cycle and as needed. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. And then the other thing, like just when we were working with the upcoming release piece, right? You know, there was this association with the Git tag versus how we were starting to look at release types. And, you know, I actually think this was actually a good example of developer, you know, being able to see the developer's persona and how they attach to that term and what it does, and just being really delicate about how we create that upcoming release. And I feel like that was a real big opportunity for our internal engineering team to chime in and give their perspective as a user as well, and balance that out. So I think, yeah, I think that it's definitely a delicate piece, and I think it's something we have to keep in mind. The other thing that I think about too in the future is, when we think about the release manager persona, they're not necessarily 100%, savvy with some of the areas of how GitLab would work from a technical standpoint. And
Yeah.
so, I think one of the things that, and maybe it's in here, but just talking about how we can bridge that gap through how we're building this so that it's more translatable to those that are just looking for certain pieces of information.
Yep. Yeah. It's great to think about, and I don't think that that's currently called out here explicitly. That might be a nice section to add, somewhere around here about managing that dialogue. But I agree, it's super, super important. Achieving that automation in release management is great, but if we aren't able to effectively communicate that to the release management teams who will need to be responsible for and managing this, then we've made a mistake somewhere along the line.
Right. So there might be, so there might be an opportunity when we look at the dashboard that's connected to this, that maybe after that first iteration, we can start to think about, okay, now let's try to get some reactions from different personas outside of the developer space on how this looks to them and how translatable it is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably an exercise that we'll just always have to be focused on. I often find that when I meet with the release management teams who are following more traditional practices, once I explain the vision to them, then it's all a lot more clear, but it's not necessarily understandable without an interpreter. So I will echo what you're saying there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So, and speaking of cross-project environment dashboard.
Yeah, that's what we talked about, but as part of bringing the category to maturity level, a viable maturity level, I feel like being able to talk about environments in the product in a more status-oriented way is really kind of table stakes for this. Then the other thing, and this we'll have to update this month. We've just recently renamed this issue a couple times.
Yes.
In order to make it more clear for everybody. But creating draft releases, or what we're now calling pre-release, upcoming releases, which is really, really important, again, for release orchestration, because you need something in the system that represents a place to collect information on something that's going to happen in the future. That's a release. So being able to create an upcoming release, even though it doesn't necessarily have a tag yet, maybe it has a milestone, maybe it doesn't, but it can start having the release plans embedded and associated with it, is really, really important. And then the next one is association of milestones with releases, which is another place where we're kind of an ecosystem thing where we're tying this releases feature in to planning. So with the milestone and a release in the future, you can have a view of delivering something very specifically via a deployment plan that's tied to deliverables that are either done, if it's a backwards looking release, or that are in progress. And so you can see the burn down chart if it's an upcoming release. With these things in place, we have actually a pretty solid foundation that somebody could use to do some release management inside of GitLab.
Yeah, and I had a quick question. So when we talk about the upcoming release, one of the things that the conversation quickly identified was different types of releases in the future outside of upcoming release. So is that something that has been discussed before, or maybe is it something we should consider updating around this vision, that we might consider different release types to address different things that are common in the community, like the pre-release terminology, et cetera?
I haven't actually seen that conversation yet, so I'm not sure what the other release types they're referring to. Do you know?
So one of the things was the pre-release terminology. So people tend to assign that, align that with an alpha, beta, et cetera type of term.
Yeah.
So we decided that upcoming release didn't mean that, and that in the future we might create another release type or types that align with those different segmentation that are commonly seen, but we need to do some user research on that. So I'm just curious, and then one of the things that even one of the developers said was, wow, yes. And then in your release overview page, you can see upcoming releases, you can see all releases, upcoming releases, pre-release,
Yeah.
those different types segmented.
Yeah, I don't know any other types, or none are jumping out to me off the top of my head. But yeah, and that sort of ties in as well. So it's just tying the different terminologies together. I think if you talk to a release manager and said, do you have a pre-release, release in progress? They would think of just like a release in progress, not that hasn't been released yet. But then at the same time, GitHub has released a feature that has pre-release is a very specific thing, meaning it has been released. So it's post-release, but it's a beta release. And where a release manager might just call that a beta release, not a beta pre-release. It's aligning that terminology, but yeah, nothing else really jumps out. We just need to make sure that, yeah, the same terminology is going to make sense for both the release manager persona and the developer persona, and that no one's going to get confused based on what we use.
Yeah, no, I agree. So that's good feedback. And so that gives just more information and definitely the need that if we were to expand that type, that we would need to do some heavy UX research to define what would be most common or expected across the personas. So that's good.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay.
And then jumping into the competitive landscape. So there's a few different tools out there on the market that do release orchestration. There's not too many of them. But one thing that they have is that environment-based view of the world. The other things they have are like workflows, which we already have in the product. And then the one thing that probably would be really good to add here is that environment scheduling piece, because I think most of the other tools in the market that do release orchestration also do environment scheduling in some way. And it would be interesting to, I think most of them are doing it in the kind of simple calendar way where people are just manually making reservations, but someone may have started implementing something that's more sophisticated, in which case we can learn from it a bit.
Was Platora the one that we were looking at the other day that does this?
Yeah, I think so. Yep.
Okay.
That was a big one. ZB
Okay.
Labs is another good product in the space. Good to be familiar with that.
And then question, like when you think about environment scheduling, is that tied into your thoughts around blackout dates and things like that?
Yeah. Although, yeah, you could look at blackout dates as a special case of environment scheduling where the environment is production. And you're just sort of blocking out the production environment from being changed on certain days. So maybe, yeah, you can implement it with just one solution. And if you make production secure, reservable, then those reservations on production are a blackout period.
Right, because you know, one of the things that I think about is like you know, specifically in environments for finance, right? There are blackout periods because of the fact with certain because of the fact that, you know, there's a quarter end or a monthly end, and they want stability in the environment for that reporting and system use.
Yeah.
So
holidays, the leading up into big changes. So companies that release like once a year or twice a year, they'll typically have a change freeze a few weeks prior to the change or after. And yeah, depending on the industry, like if you're in the sports industry, then you may have a change freeze while you're having something around like the World Cup or something like that, and you just want everything to be super stable during a specific period. So all of those kinds of things are possible and use cases for this.
Okay.
And one that release managers care about a lot, so probably also should be.
Exactly. And yeah, exactly. So very good. Thank you.
And then in terms of analysts, we do participate in the release orchestration analyst reports. So we're actually going through one now, so we'll get some more feedback. But at the moment, what do we have here? Yeah. So this is actually a really nice one that could be maybe part of the next maturity plan after this one. But once we have the milestone in the release, we then know how to link that release to tickets that are part of that release. And then in theory, we can, and this is what like having, there's also the issue of, it was somewhere around here, we talked about it earlier, where you could generate the release from within GitLab. this has a sample syntax of what that might look like instead of using an API call. But what this would do is say, okay, I already know the milestone that's associated with this release, and I know that you're generating a release now. So I'll just go take a look at all of the issues that have that milestone and automatically generate release notes for you based on, you know, the titles of those issues or something like that. And then maybe it outputs as an HTML file or something else that can then be displayed as part of the release. That would be super, super cool. And then we're starting to do some interesting things. We don't just have a little bit of you know, smarts in the release process and you can start to do orchestration, but we're taking advantage of kind of the GitLab single application and saying, you know, GitLab also knows about issues. So we can tie those together and show it all in one place, and it's all linked up nicely. Another thing that could be there eventually is incidents associated with releases, and kind of you're starting to tie everything together in a really interesting way. Then you start getting into that change dashboard as well, and it's all one big thing that, you know.
Right, like, and one of the things I think I mentioned when we were talking about the change board and my comments yesterday on the issue was, you know, sometimes there's corrective action. And so you want to be able to tie a change incident with the corrective action to know that that has been closed out and completed successfully.
Yep. Exactly. So then in terms of customer success and sales, they actually hear a different perspective as well. So they're interested in a release orchestration dashboard. We haven't been able to build this yet because we're still building out the basic pieces of it. But you can imagine once we have teams creating future releases and they have milestones associated with them, and there's ones that have been released, there's ones that are in progress, and so on. You'll want a dashboard to see all of those. So this issue is still needs to be refined a bit. It's in the 12.3 release, but I'm sure we can come up with a nice MVC once we have these things done that can show you the releases in progress and maybe like a burn down chart for future ones, or just like do something there to get the ball rolling and build out an MVC for this view.
Yeah, and the one thing that I did hear, I can't remember which channel I saw it, but I think it's interesting because of the, you know, the fact that we're a single application, right? Like as we start to see these dashboards, like the idea is that you can take, you know, the idea to be able to take and construct this dashboard information the way you want it, right?
Yep.
Maybe widgets or something like that. Because at the end of the day, like, I think when we look at the full life cycle of DevOps being captured, like there are segments of that we want to see only because that's our role and we're kind of focused there. But then also the ability to have sort of this centralized view that is maybe adjustable based on the needs of the company and their process.
At the moment, we're building everything on top of this the dashboard here, kind of the central dashboard, which is per kind of per user. So I can add projects that I care about here to this dashboard. The pipeline dashboard is here. The environment dashboard will be here also. So I can customize it to myself. But what we don't really have is like publishing these to be shared by the team, which is an interesting feature. And I think the managed team is looking at making that possible. They own sort of the dashboard infrastructure that we hang different dashboards on, which is not to say that we can't contribute to it. We certainly can. But it would be good to maybe chat with the product manager for Manage and see where the vision is for improving this dashboard and how we can either influence that or contribute to it in some way.
Yeah, that was actually the question I was going to ask you, is what stage we would be like who owns that sort of overall framework so we're doing it consistently, and that answered my question. So yeah, perfect.
Customer issues, looking for polish. Yeah, so here I touch on the, oh, actually, yeah, I think that this link is actually wrong, 65123. But this is an interesting issue as well, which lets you add more artifacts to the release itself. I think this was supposed to be part of, yeah, so what this mentions here is making the release as part of the GitLab CI YAML, which is the syntax that I showed you in the last issue. But this issue is interesting as well for having, right now you can add a link to a release, and it can point to whatever your download is, like this. But we could support other kinds of things like artifacts and packages and linking those to the release. So then we're tying into more GitLab features and bringing those into release as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, and then the last two, we talk about a very, very interesting issue, which is runbooks. So one of the things that, I think we've talked about this one before, but I'll just run through it again for anybody else who ends up watching this, is one of the things that these release managers do in these Excel files is they'll just have a list on a tab with like 20, 30 steps of things that need to be done. And we actually do that ourselves in some places. I don't think we do this anymore actually now with the new release process, but this is as of 4 or 5 months ago. We had an issue that had someone going through and ticking off these little tick boxes and reading the instructions and running commands and doing different things as part of our release. In our case, we had technical people doing it, but you can also have non-technical users doing a lot of different things. So if you imagine maybe somebody is coordinating a press release or something like that, so you've got marketing folks that have tasks to do in a release, you wouldn't want to put those inside of the pipeline where there's like a manual task that a marketing person goes through and clicks on, when it's done. That's too weird. It's not a nice way to do it. But we do have this really cool feature that we released recently. I have a picture of it in here. Runbooks for releases. So there's something called Jupyter Runbooks, which you can deploy as part of GitLab to your Kubernetes cluster. And what it gives you is basically a markdown file where you can also embed code and instructions and checkboxes and things like that. And it's easy to do because it's in Markdown, so non-technical users can make these. And then those can then be associated with the release. So the release can, at that point, once this feature is done, have a plan that goes with them. And then we've sort of got the full Excel document, at least at a basic level. Yeah, I don't know where the picture ended up going.
There was a image.
There was like a big picture in here. Maybe the docs has it.
So when we think of I think that's an excellent example of a use case, like the press release for a release. And how would you obviously we don't want our pipeline, but how would you envision that? What would that look like in play with development, marketing, etc.?
So it's still to be determined to a certain extent. But I think that the easiest way to think about it is very, very similar to these issues here to start with, where you might have a run book, and the release managers might just be responsible for doing this, but there's no reason this couldn't have an assignee name next to it. So a little unticked text box that says @jlenny : go call the marketing department and tell them that we're ready. And so we could all have this open, even like the old school command center thing. If you're all in a big room together, you could have this projected and then just be ticking these off together and tracking what's going on.
Or for automated, you could say the press release is in this file location and it stays empty until it's ready. And then you could grab that file, right? And then validate.
That's right. And the nice thing about the Jupyter Runbooks is that they're code enabled. So you could have a button here next to this that creates that file. Or you could have a button here that validates that the pipeline has finished. And you can wire all these things together in interesting ways.
Okay, getting it. This is awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
This is good.
It's just a really, really nice feature that we can grow a lot of capabilities from. And the other thing that we can do is also then, if we think about the release dashboard, if we think about the releases page, or even just looking at a single release, that release could show a status about maybe 15 of 42 tick boxes in the plan have been completed, or status update that's associated with that.
Yeah. Or another thing is if there is issues in the pipeline, or there seems to be a high volume of change, maybe you want to revalidate the press release to make sure that it's still aligned, something like that. Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
So that's this. Let's take a look at the issue list and just see if anything jumps out to me as being important to talk about that's not in the plan.
Okay.
Uh,
The one things I did think that is a conflict is that like the environment dashboard, I think did get pushed out to 12.3.
mhm.
So we might have to rethink like some of the things that we were talking about that were in succession of that and making sure that they're not too up against each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's not a lot that's kind of like we do A and then B builds on top of A and then C builds on top of B where they're all tightly coupled like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's okay. Um, it does still show 12.2 at the moment, but maybe that's just about to change.
Oh wait,
But
no,
yeah,
maybe it is 12.2. I
there's
might have
no
had.
special tying of anything in that way. A lot of this can be built independently based on where you're seeing the most customer demand and move things around.
Okay,
The
good.
things that are listed in the maturity section, though, I think do make sense to do first because a lot of the other features that are going to be tied to them are built on top of them. But the environment dashboard is not one of those.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some other nice things like permanent link to the latest version of a release. And
Actually, you know what I was thinking about? Okay, so the cross projects dashboard, we had another dashboard we were talking about.
there's a cross-project pipeline, environment, and release orchestration one, which might be about like release statuses.
Right, and so what I was thinking, well, I guess they could be independent. Um, okay, but I mean,
The
just
way we envisioned it was that so this has like the drop down here, and it only has operations at the moment. It will also have pipeline. It will also have release, something like that, environment.
yeah, but and this is a question like, as far as yes, they could be independent, but like when we look at one of these dashboards coming out, do we want to space some time to observe and collect information before we start another dashboard, just to make sure we're kind of incorporating those lessons? Or I guess is our
It
I mean,
depends, is unfortunately the
yeah,
answer.
right.
um, I think for the moment, these largely have different audiences. So
Hmm.
you're not dumping too much directly on the same people in too fast of a pace.
Hmm.
Although people tend to not complain about that too much. Um, you definitely want to save capacity for future iterations of these things. Like as we're rolling out these big features, we can't just move on to the next big feature and move on to the next big feature.
Yeah.
That is important for sure.
Yeah, one
But
of the things, speaking of the iterations, one of the things I was thinking about is, kind of how we're going to, the way we're deploying now, because we have the feature flag capability, and how that would interact with some of this, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the feature flag feature has a
Hmm.
nice thing to tie a like so the feature flags, we're going to enable them to point to an issue that introduced them. That issue will have a milestone. The release will also be able to point to the milestone. So there could be a view for a release that says, show me all the feature flags that were implemented in this release and what their status is, which would be super, super interesting. And maybe you can even toggle them from there. There's no issue for that yet, but that's a really interesting idea. And as we implement some of these basic foundational things, we're going to be thinking of those things ourselves. Our customers are going to be asking us for these capabilities, but there's so much potential here, just like that.
Yeah, good, really good. Okay, let's go back to the list. Sorry, see what we have here.
This one here.
Yeah, let's go. Did you have it sorted by
Popularity is
yeah,
the
popularity?
more interesting one.
Hmm.
Notifications for releases is a very nice one as well, where people want to subscribe to you don't care about all the pipelines that run in a project, but you want to know whenever they make a new release. So people might subscribe, for example, to GitLab in order to know when a new release is coming out. Oh yeah, and here's the upcoming one that we were talking about.
Hmm. Add more release artifact types. We talked about that. Add delete release using the UI, which we talked. That's connected to upcoming releases. Notifications.
There's
Update.
nothing gigantic. Another filter we can do here is like the FY20 vision
Hmm.
label. Will show us the big ones.
Release generation from the GitLab.
I think we talked about all these.
Optimally creates new fermented tags.
So the plan, and this label means at the beginning of the year, I think it was November that we decided these. We decided these were the things that we wanted to try and get done this year. So that's why all of these have a milestone this year.
Right, and I think that's a good label: search, release orchestration, product vision FY20, and then sorted by popularity. I think that's something I take a deeper dive on, so that's good.
Yeah, and like this, seeing this 12.7 and most upvotes, I put this in 12.7 back when I was just kind of thinking about all these and had not really gotten any customer feedback yet. This is saying this is more important than I thought it was. So that's a signal that maybe we should swap that out with,
something else. Yeah.
I think this one is really important, but maybe the run books could wait a bit, or maybe even the dashboard could potentially wait a bit. But we can make those considerations.
Absolutely.
Like ones like the upcoming status and the associating milestone are not highly upvoted because people don't understand yet the power that these will have in the future. Whereas this is just something that's like clearly nice right away that's obvious.
Right, and that's something that I think that actually I was thinking about as you're talking is we're going through this is that thinking about our personas and users, a user community. There's an opportunity to do customer interviews with our personas to sort of balance out how we're prioritizing this too, right? And take again, it's that delicate balance of current user community and potential growing user community.
We've also got our internal release team that's responsible for shipping GitLab, and they're great to talk to. Marin is the manager of that department.
Yeah.
And we actually have a dog fooding issue to make sure that so if you look right now, I'm in the GitLab org, but if I go to GitLab CE, and then we have the releases tab here, we aren't generating these currently with every release. And the reason for that is because the team has been so busy rolling out this entirely new release process that they just haven't had time. And I'm respecting their request to please leave them alone for the moment because of the complexity of what they're doing. But very, very soon, now that new process is in place, we should help them make an update to the release process for GitLab so that new versions of GitLab are showing up here. People can then come here, find the tag, see what's in the changelog, download the source code, and start taking advantage of being aware of this feature.
No, I think that's a good call out. Awesome. This has been really helpful. Yeah, I think the one thing that I would probably circle back on is one, yes, reevaluating our priority for the roadmap based on popularity, more customer interviews for the different personas just to get more information, or looking at previous sales conversations with that persona. And then I think the other thing is the UX, the UX research I think would be really powerful for us in this space because it's got so many possibilities. And getting to a place where it's like, okay, how do we know, yes, these are popular, yes, we're implementing these things, but how do we know we're growing the vision for the thought out personas that would need this and use this, and getting more crisp about what that hypothesis would be and how we would measure that and then adjust.
For sure. And the other thing that we just need to do, or that you can do a better job on than me when I was spread so thin, is just communicating this very clearly internally to the engineering team so that when they're looking at these issues, they understand what they're building and why and how it ties into this big picture. And then also just kind of communicating that generally so that our marketing team knows what's coming and how they can start talking about it. Our sales team knows what features are coming out and how they can sell them. Being able to focus on these 4 categories like you're able to is going to be very, very powerful because you're able to have time to do those things, which will make you very successful and your product very successful.
Yeah, no, and I think that you did a great job. You had a lot, though.
I did my best. I had a lot on
No,
my plate, and I think it's gone well. I don't think
no,
it's gone bad.
seriously, like, I mean, there's so much vision laid out here already. Like, that's a lot that you've produced. So, it's just more time.
Yeah,
And so I think that's great. And yeah, I think that's a good call out on engineering. Like, if that's one thing that I did notice is that um, I really appreciated, I'm gonna call him out on recording, Shinya,
hmm,
who was able to, like, he grasped it.
yeah,
And he was talking to Jason Goodman and he was like, no, this is how this would work. Take off your developer hat for a second. And like, this is really what we're thinking. And
yeah,
I thought that was beautiful. And so, yeah, I think that that is a good call out. And then, like, when I think about those rolling monthly vision reviews, that would be engineering user experience and connecting those dots and having those conversations.
yeah. Totally agree.
Cool.
Um, yeah, and it's just nicer. I think the team will be more engaged and more excited when they understand the features and what they're building and why.
The benefit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah,
Awesome. All right.
cool.
Well, thank you,
Um,
Jason.
yeah,
And appreciate this. This has been really helpful. So